Awesome. Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Connor, and it's so good to be worshiping with y'all today. Shout out to the gays for letting us know what they love about Christmas. And I love to hear that because I feel like you get a cool little window into people's lives when they talk about that kind of stuff, how their families spend time around Christmas. You see like what they value. Like, I didn't know that Chad is weirdly obsessed with Christmas lights. That's awesome. That's a cool thing to know. And another weird example, if you came into my house right now, you would see Muppets stuff. Like you would see Muppets socks, a mug here or there, or a Muppets t-shirt here or there. And that's not because I'm a 28-year-old man who's weirdly obsessed with the Muppets. And thank the Lord, right? That would be really cringe. But it's because every Christmas, one of my grandmothers who worked in a Muppets museum, yeah, that's a thing, she would give us Muppet stuff every Christmas. And when I look at that stuff and think about that tradition of her giving us that, I'm reminded that, she loves me and she loves our family. And just like how families experience this season in our own unique ways, there was a family way back then that experienced the first Christmas in a very special way too. This month, as we move towards Christmas, we're looking closely at the people who were a part of that first Christmas, Jesus' family. And it's cool to see how real these people were, how much we can share in common with them, and how much we can connect with them, which I get. It might be tough to see how a family that lived 2,000 years ago in the Middle East speaks a different language from us. Might be tough to see how they have a lot in common with us, but they do. They had to pay taxes. They had to go somewhere to do something for the government they didn't want to do, and we have to do that. They had a job they had to do to provide for their families, and we have to do that too. And they had their own unique circumstances for sure, but in the lives of Jesus' family, we see something about our experience as humans. Today we're going to see something that every person has to go through in one form or another. And we see that something in the story we're reading about today. And so we're going to open up our Bibles to Luke chapter 1, and we're going to start reading at the 5th verse. And we're going to read about this woman named Elizabeth and this man named Zechariah. So again, Luke chapter 1, verse 5. If you don't have a Bible and you would love to have one, we have some in the back of the room right there for you to not only read, but you can keep it if you want. That's totally cool. Luke chapter 1, verse 5. And it says, "In the days of Herod, king of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah, of the division of Abijah. And he had a wife from the daughters of Aaron, and her name was Elizabeth. And they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord, but they had no child, because Elizabeth was barren, and both were advanced in years. Now, while he was serving as a priest before God, when his division was on duty, according to the custom of the priesthood, he was chosen by lot to enter the temple and burn incense. And the whole multitude of people were praying outside at the hour of incense, and there appeared to him an angel of the Lord, standing on the right side of the altar of incense. And Zechariah was troubled when he saw him, and fear fell upon him. But the angel said to him, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. And your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name John." Like most of our families, Jesus had an extended family. His mom, Mary, had a cousin named Elizabeth, and she was married to a man named Zechariah. Now, Zechariah was a priest, and he's sort of the central character in this story. You see, Zechariah was a descendant of this guy named Aaron, who way back in the Old Testament was Moses' brother. And as was tradition back then, if you were a direct descendant of Aaron, then guess what? You are automatically a priest. That was automatically your career in life. Sort of like how when we are born, you are automatically a fan of whatever X sports team that your parents are a fan of. Does not matter if that team is a disappointment year after year, you are stuck with them. It's a bummer. Zechariah was a priest, and he belonged to what was called a section. And you can think of it like a shift at work. Because there were so many descendants of Aaron, there were a ton of priests. And so outside of a few special holidays like Passover, when every priest was serving in the temple, the only time that Zechariah was serving as a priest, being in the temple, offering up sacrifices to God as an act of worship, the only time he did that was 2 weeks in the entire year. Which I get, sounds like an awesome setup. Oh, I only have 2 weeks of work? That's sick. But priests who loved their work would have looked forward to those weeks of service above everything, where they could be with God, in the presence of God, in that special place, doing what they loved. It would have been the highlight of their lives. And so outside of those 2 weeks and a few special holidays, Zechariah would have spent his time waiting. And it sounds like a good life so far, with an awesome career. But in Zechariah's and Elizabeth's life, there was a tragedy. As any person in that culture would have done, Zechariah and Elizabeth, they would have wanted kids to glorify God. In the earliest pages of the Bible, God speaks his blessing over humanity to be fruitful and multiply and to fill the earth, to bring people into the world, to delight in the creation that God has made for us. And so back then, and today, it was a good and holy thing not only for you to be married, but to have kids. But it got to a point back then, and not in a good way, where socially, if you were a good Jew, then you should have kids. If you were a good Jew, you would do that. And Zechariah and Elizabeth, they were good people. Verse 6 says, "And they were both righteous before God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and statutes of the Lord." A mentality that existed back then, and still kind of does today, is that if you do good, then good things will happen to you. If you do good, then good will come your way. And so you have this couple that loves the Lord and wants to glorify him through raising a family. And so for years, Zechariah and Elizabeth, they would have wanted that. But instead, they were waiting. They're doing everything right. They're doing everything they're supposed to be doing, but they were waiting. And I want to pause there. And I want you to ask yourself if you've ever had to wait. From an early age, we wait for small things like you got to wait your turn to play with that toy, or you got to wait in line at Starbucks while the person in front of you has their 25-word coffee order with flaxseed milk, which is disgusting. You got to wait in line. Or when you're a kid and you're going to the water park and you ask your mom, "Hey mom, how much longer is it going to be?" And she says, "Connor, if you ask that again, I will kill you." We have to wait for small things. But we also have to wait for big things too. As I've gotten older, and maybe it's just me, but I feel like life is just moving from one season of waiting to the next. Like when I was in high school, I'm waiting for my driver's license so I can, get around independently. Or I've heard people older than me say, "I'm waiting till I retire so I can spend more time with my family and with my grandkids." And I was talking with a few people about this just the other day, but I feel, and a lot of other people feel this about waiting, and so I hope you don't feel alone when I say this, but it's so easy to feel that you're the last one to the destination, that you have to wait longer than everyone else. Like there have been times when I have been in a waiting for something season, and I look at my life and I compare it to my friends and other people around me, and I feel like I have to wait the longest. Have y'all ever felt that way? Like I have to wait longer for the college degree, for the marriage, for the house, for the promotion, for the family. Sometimes in life, you just have to wait. I get that. But also, why is that? Maybe you've asked, am I just slower than everyone else? Did I do something wrong? Is it something about me? Is it something I'm doing or not doing? And you might be doing everything right. You might be doing everything you're supposed to be doing, but you're still waiting. And when you're in that place, especially for, like the important stuff, it's so easy to ask yourself, man, does God not see me waiting right now? Does God not hear me right now? I mean, you have to wonder if Zechariah and Elizabeth, if they were asking those questions. Because after a long time, maybe doubt would have rooted itself in Zechariah and Elizabeth. Maybe they would have doubted if they'd ever have a child. Maybe they thought that something was wrong with them, or that, they had done something wrong. Because again, back then, that do good things will happen to you mentality. And if bad stuff is happening to you, well, back then they thought that meant, oh, you must have sinned, or your parents sinned, and that's why all this is happening to you. But Zechariah and Elizabeth, they were doing everything right. And, also a huge, big other pressure, back then, childlessness, that was like legit grounds for divorce back then. That's how serious this is right now. So throw that huge social pressure into the mix, and you already have all of this fear in this decades-long season of waiting. And so after years of hoping, doubting, and waiting, Zechariah went up to Jerusalem with his section to serve in the temple. And as was custom, one evening, he was chosen to go into the inner court and make an offering in the temple to God. And while that sacrifice is being made, the people would be outside waiting for the priest to come back outside and bless them. There were people outside of that temple waiting, but tonight was different. Zechariah stayed inside for a long time. He walked into that inner court with all of his stuff that was on his heart. I mean, you can't blame the guy that on his biggest day when he can finally be back in the temple, being with God, praising God. You can't blame the guy that his personal tragedy is just in the back of his mind. But there's something really cool to note here, is that Zechariah, he was praying. He was waiting, but what you see is that whatever Zechariah had on his heart, he believed that he could bring it to God in his waiting. And I'll be honest, I don't know why Zechariah and Elizabeth had to wait so long, but maybe God was doing something through it. Maybe he's doing that with us right now, that he's deepening your faith in him, strengthening your trust in him. In our absence of answers for why we have to wait longer than everyone else, maybe he's drawing us closer to him because he has better answers for us. When we're waiting for something we need, maybe it's at that point that we realize that we need him and we need the life that he offers us, the full life that you've been waiting for. Maybe God is doing something in the waiting. And so Zechariah, he was in that temple, waiting for God to say or do something. And God responded. An angel appears while Zechariah is praying. And we don't know what he's praying, but we know that he was, because the angel says in verse 13, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard. And your wife Elizabeth will bear you a son, and you shall call his name John. And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth." And so when he finally comes outside, Zechariah couldn't speak. And the people knew that something must have happened. And the angel had taken away Zechariah's words, I think, because maybe God just wanted Zechariah just to be quiet and watch what God could do in his life. And so in this wordless days of joy, Zechariah finished his work with his section in those 2 weeks, and he went home. And the message of God came true. And he and Elizabeth knew that they were going to have a baby. And now I'm sure that their waiting did not end there, because again, real people, real story, this happened. Elizabeth was old, and I'm no doctor, but the older you are, the tougher the pregnancy can be. And so Elizabeth spent 9 months continuing to wait to see if everything would turn out okay. And so with their continued doubts and with their fears, but also with their hopes, they were waiting. But maybe, just maybe, at that point, the waiting became easier because they knew from what the angel told them that the waiting was not the end for them. And maybe that's what God wants us to know today, that the waiting is not the end of God's plan for us. It doesn't matter what good thing you're waiting for. Some of us might be waiting for good news about a diagnosis, or some of us might be waiting for the relationship that you've always dreamed of. I have someone in my life who is waiting for the dust to settle in their family because of the election. One of my best friends is waiting for a breakthrough in his career. We might be waiting for something God has called us to, something he wants for us, but he's just not here yet. And some of you might be waiting to be rescued from a situation that you had no part in creating. We're waiting. Back then, God's people, they were waiting for a Messiah, for someone to free them from oppression, not only oppression from the Romans, but oppression from sin and death. But their waiting was not the end of God's plan for them. We as Christians, we're waiting for Jesus to return in the fullness of his glory and to make every wrong thing right. And our hope is that our waiting is not the end. Zechariah and Elizabeth, they thought they were never going to have a child. But childlessness was not the end of God's plan for them. God had a plan, even in the midst of their waiting, and it was going to be amazing. And when you can rest in that confidence that God has a hope and a future for you, it can make it easier to believe this awesome truth that we know a God who was with us, made himself literally with us in the waiting. I use that word literally deliberately right here, because one of the names we hear Jesus given in the Christmas story is Emmanuel, which means God with us. That's who Jesus is, God with you. And God is so with you that just like how you, me, and every human being who has ever lived has to wait, God waits. For about 400 years, there was no word given to a prophet of Israel between the Old and the New Testament. And that's because God was waiting. Jesus is born, and outside of like one story we hear about him when he was a kid, up until the point when he was about 30 years old, he was waiting for his ministry to begin. 30 years, Jesus was waiting. And I don't think that he was completely idle during that time, but the Bible tells us that he wasn't making the blind see, he wasn't making the lame walk during that time. He was waiting. Jesus made himself so with us in the waiting back then, and he is with you now in your waiting. Now look, I don't want to tie a pretty bow on this thing called life like it's a Christmas present and just tell you that man, waiting is great, so much good's going to come from waiting. It's natural. Everyone has to go through it. Because honestly, I don't know why we all have to wait so much for so many things in life. I don't know why that just as a part of our journey at every step, we can always find ourselves waiting. I don't have an answer for that. But what I do know, and what I do believe, and it's good news for us today, is that God is doing something in our hearts through it. That he is with us in our waiting, and our waiting is not the end of God's plan for you. Before Jesus came into this world, he had a family with people like Elizabeth, Zechariah, and later their son John, who waited. Across years and through doubt and discouragement, they were waiting for God's plan for them. And they didn't know it at the time, but God's plan for them was so much bigger than themselves. It was bigger than anything they could have ever imagined. And even though it was difficult, it was worth the wait. God's plan for them was worth the wait because God's plan was Jesus. And Jesus, who is God with us, Jesus waited. Just like how every one of us has to wait. Jesus waited because he is with you and he is for you. And he waited for the redemption of our hearts so that we could be called God's children again because he thought that was worth waiting for. You were worth waiting for. So no matter what waiting you find yourself in today, have hope, everyone. Because God is with you in the waiting, and he is never, ever failing. Let's pray.